Creating a wetland like this is not cheap, and it's not something we could do on our own. Put in a snake hibernaculum, approximately an 8-foot deep hole, about 8 feet in diameter, and that was filled with concrete, cinder blocks, a lot of other debris.
Hi everyone, my name's Ranger M, and I work at Catfish Creek Conservation Authority. I'm the community outreach technician, and that means I do a lot of this, chatting about all things nature and conservation with kids, adults, teachers, everyone. I love to knowledge share, and that's just what I'm going to do with you. So come on, let's go learn with Ranger M. So Scott, when we were talking last time, you mentioned you had this beautiful big property and you've actually done a lot of rehab work on it. And I would love it if you could show us some of your projects here.
Yeah, I'd be happy to show you around and tell you a bit about it.
Okay, awesome. Let's head out. So can you give us an overview of your property and kind of what you've done here?
Yeah, well, it's a 55-acre property, and about 10 years to find the perfect property.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we liked about this area is that it was partly provincially significant wetland and partly an area of natural and scientific interest. So it had a certain amount of protections already, though there were a number of fields that were used for agriculture, and we wanted to renaturalize those spots. So everything from creating brush piles to wetlands to removing non-native species, digging vernal pools. We've tried to look at many ways to enhance the property, to revert it back to nature and make it as useful to wildlife as possible.
So what will we come across first?
Well, I think as we're walking, you may see some small brush piles along the way, and as we get closer to the field, we've created a large vernal pool on the side of the trail.
So I see that you have a trail cam. Do you spot a lot of wildlife?
Yeah, so we installed quite a few trail cams in various areas of the woodlot in order just to see what was on the property, and we've had some pretty amazing encounters of coyote going after raccoon and pileatids and ruffed grouse and all kinds of things on these cameras. So a really good way to have a sneak peek at what's going on behind the scenes.
How many species have you seen or logged?
Well, we have just over 140 species of birds that we've documented this past year.
That's awesome.
And quite a few mammals, a few reptiles and amphibians. The list is growing every time we go out, and I have a growing interest in botany as well, so we're trying to document all the plant species on the property as well.
Oh, very neat. And that will be really cool because your practices you're implementing, you'll be able to see if there's an increase, you're seeing new species, rare species, or even species at risk on your property because of maybe some of the things you've implemented.
Yeah, exactly. And if we just focused on the animal, we wouldn't know enough about the habitat, and I think it all intertwines.
So what are you going to show us here, Scott?
Well, when we bought the property, we saw that there was a lot of wetland habitat in the forest, so swamp. However, on drier years, we saw that water basically disappeared very quickly. So in order to provide benefit for amphibians that breed in wetland pools, we wanted to create water that would last a little bit longer. So we started to dig vernal pools in some of these woodland areas. And a vernal pool is basically a temporary wetland that lasts long enough for amphibians such as frogs and salamanders to have their eggs develop into tadpoles or larvae and then morph into young individuals back on the land. So we were able to find a few spots that were already low, would hold a certain amount of water, and we deepened those areas. So we added another 2 to 3 feet of depth, and so those will hold water long into the summer in order for the amphibians to successfully morph into young individuals.
Did you know infrastructure like old wells and building foundations, along with natural features like ant mounds and rodent burrows, are all examples of snake hibernation sites? Did you know infrastructure like old wells and building foundations, along with natural features like ant mounds and rodent burrows, are all examples of snake hibernation sites? Okay, Scott, we can obviously tell that we've reached a pretty pinnacle area in your property. Tell us what we have here.
Okay, well, this is a retired farm field and we wanted to do a few things to improve it for wildlife. And one of those things was to put in a snake hibernaculum, and basically what that is a place that snakes can go down below the frost line to survive the winter. And you can see first there's a big pile of brush here, and that's not the main hibernaculum, but that is an area that the snakes will be able to use when they emerge from the hibernaculum. But the main hibernaculum is actually hidden under the snow, so you can see a few of the rocks here. And it extends quite a ways up, so that was the area was approximately an 8-foot deep hole, about 8 feet in diameter, and that was filled with concrete, cinder blocks, a lot of other debris that would basically stabilize the hole and allow a lot of little crevices for the snakes to get down below the frost line. You need it deep enough, obviously, to get below the frost line, and if you can match it up with your water table, it will allow for a certain amount of water condensation to develop so the snakes don't dehydrate over the winter.
Okay.
Yeah, and so what we did on top of all of the concrete debris is put large field stones, and so that will act as a heat sink. So in the spring and in the fall, when the snakes first go in the fall and when they first come out in the spring, the radiant heat, so the heat absorbed by the rocks, will provide a good basking opportunity for all of these snakes. And the small crevices between the rocks will allow protection from predators, as well as the large brush pile that we've created. So when developing these things, you want to ensure that there's multiple access points. So not only are there cinder blocks placed down like a ramp into the deeper area of the hibernaculum, there's also plastic tubes with a number of holes drilled in the side. So there's various access points that the snakes can retreat to and climb out of at different points during the winter and spring. Why that's important is at different times of the winter, the snakes may want to move up or down in the chambers of the hibernaculum to get to that sweet spot of temperature. Generally around 4 degrees is where it's probably safe for them to stay at. They aren't using up their fat reserves, so they're staying cold enough, but it's not too warm that, again, they would use up their fat reserves, not too cold that they would freeze to death. So very important to have a lot of opportunities for the snakes to find their microclimate or microhabitat.
Okay. So what kind of snakes do you find in this hibernaculum?
On the property, we found primarily eastern garter snake and northern brown snake, though on neighbors' properties there have been northern red-bellied snake, eastern milk snake, and there's a very old record, or a few old records from the 1940s and before, of the threatened eastern hognose snake. And so we're hoping that the eastern hognose snake is still here. We won't hold our breath. Hognose snakes, though, wouldn't really use this type of hibernaculum. They bury down into a sandy area. But our eastern garter snake, northern brown snake, and eastern milk snake would all use a hibernaculum like this.
And they're all good and happy in there together?
Yeah, absolutely. They would use this communally. However, milk snakes are known to sometimes eat other snakes.
Oh.
However, during a cold fall, winter, and early spring, they're not going to be feeding, and we'll find those types of species together.
Now, can you kind of talk about this brush pile and the long line of brush you have going into the forest?
What we've done in this area, obviously, you can see the wetland behind me. We've created a wetland, and that left a lot of the spoil piles placed here, and so those were devoid of any vegetation. So it's actually quite dangerous for a snake to move over land without any protection. So until that vegetation grows up, we wanted to ensure that there were safe areas for the snakes. So even once vegetation grows up, brush piles are very important for snakes. It provides movement corridors as well as habitat for their prey items such as mice. So this large brush pile is directly beside the rock hibernaculum, but further on we also have a smaller brush pile that we want to extend to the woodlot, and that will provide a safe access point until the vegetation grows up next spring.
Did you know 17 species of snakes call Ontario home? Did you know 17 species of snakes call Ontario home? Snakes will do anything to avoid humans through camouflage, climbing trees, or even living in water. But when that doesn't work, they have some pretty cool tactics to scare us away. Milk snakes will vibrate their tails to appear and even sound like a rattlesnake. Eastern hognose snakes have the ability to flatten their necks to look like a cobra, and if that doesn't work, they really dive into their acting skills and play dead. So that's really neat hearing about the way snakes hibernate. And obviously behind us is another big structure. Can you tell us about your wetland and kind of the process it was to put it into your property?
First, I'll start about why we felt the need for wetland on the property. Again, it had a lot of ephemeral swamp, so temporary wetland in the swamp, but it had no or very little permanent water on the property. So there's a couple of small ponds, but very tiny. And this large field, again, we wanted to incorporate a lot of habitat features. It was this wetland which will be a focal point for a lot of wildlife species. So during the hottest part of the summer, there will be an opportunity for birds, for reptiles, amphibians, mammals, all to use this permanent water feature. It was a bit of a challenge to see how this would work financially. Creating a wetland like this is not cheap, and it's not something we could do on our own. Obviously, we contributed a certain amount of money for the wetland, but we also had partners through the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, Clean Water Program, Ducks Unlimited, and others all stepped up to find funding. So, many thousands of dollars later, we now have the beginnings of this wetland. And when I say beginnings, it's because the hole in the ground and the water is just the beginning. It's the vegetation that needs to come in, and then the wildlife. And you get your beneficial bacteria in the water and your plants in the water, and all of that will eventually create a very biodiverse and useful wetland. However, for the process, this is a groundwater fed wetland. This is not a surface water wetland. We realized very quickly that we had a thin layer of topsoil and the rest was pure sand. So if you know anything about sand, you pour water in and it drains away.
We did just learn about sand, so.
Yeah, so it's not the greatest for holding water. We did not have a clay base or a really wet organic base, so we knew that we had to either reach groundwater or not have a wetland. And so that worked fine. On the lower end, about a meter down, we were able to hit water. However, it was a bit of a hill. So you can see in the area there's these large hills. This was all flat ground before, and those large hills were the spoil piles or the substrate taken out of the wetland. However, what that has provided is a new and unique feature and a new type of habitat for the area. We have these rolling hills. It'll create microclimates, different moisture regimes, and when you get down into the wetland, again, it's a new type of habitat. So all of this together will, I think, increase biodiversity significantly. And what we're doing in order to renaturalize this area to make it, again, more useful to native wildlife is to plant native plants. So it might be a little hard to see with the snow, but there's a number of plugs. This grass here, the savanna grass, was one of our bigger plugs, but we have hundreds of small plugs of native plants that were donated to us by many individuals across Ontario. If you want to attract the most native wildlife by planting native plant species, that's probably your quickest way to do so. And I think that's something everybody needs to think about. Instead of planting that Norway maple or that Japanese maple, maybe look at what our native species have to offer your property.
Can you touch on that structure on the far side of your wetland?
The structure that you see on the other side of the wetland is actually straw bales staked along the shoreline. And there's a couple layers of those straw bales and stakes, and that is basically bioengineering for erosion control. We realized pretty quickly that when you put a lot of soil up on a big hill and you get a lot of rain, eventually that soil ends up back in your wetlands. So we didn't want to have all that work for nothing. So we talked to a number of folks, including Brad Glassman at the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, who's an engineer, and told us a few ideas of what we can do to prevent erosion. So in addition to stopping the erosion coming down the hills, we wanted to stabilize the soil as well. So you can't see it now, but if we were to dig down, we would find oats that are about this tall. So the wetland was put in September, and we seeded a lot of the open bare ground with oats. And oats germinate very quickly. They can survive in pretty cold weather, and their root systems will stabilize the soil, and the plant themselves will stop active erosions from coming down. But the good thing about oats is that they will die off over the winter. The roots will still hold soil in place, and by spring they won't interfere with native plants coming up.
Oh, very neat. And then finally, I have another question about your wetland. Is obviously that you have trees in your pond. What are those for?
When we first designed the wetland, we wanted to ensure that there were opportunities for various wildlife. And of course, being a reptile biologist or herpetologist, turtles, snakes were a big part of what I wanted to benefit from this. So the trees will provide basking opportunities for turtles, and the submerged portion will provide habitat for a number of species. So looking at this wetland and the plants that we've decided to put in the area and the features created, we want to have waterfowl, we want to have shorebirds, we want to have reptiles, amphibians, and we are doubtful that we're going to put any fish in, or at least any fish that would attack amphibian eggs. So this should be an extremely beneficial spot for amphibians, and we are hoping for many, many thousands of frogs using this habitat.
Well, that's really amazing. It sounds like you created such a structure and ecosystem that you're going to have a very happy habitat and ecosystem cycle, that there's going to be so many frogs for the migratory birds and the shoreline birds to eat, and the turtles to clean it all up afterwards and everything like that, that it'll just be a perfect ecosystem, especially that you can just observe grow and become a better ecosystem and a better part of southwestern Ontario overall.
Exactly, it's a miniature version of the ecosystem that we want to see across southwestern Ontario, and unfortunately in a lot of areas we're unable to do that. And you know, it's nothing against farmers. We need farms, we need to eat, but we also need green spaces and natural areas and connected natural areas for the overall benefit of not only wildlife but humans too, because as soon as we start fracturing our ecosystem to a point where species start to decline and habitats start to fail, it will ultimately impact our water quality and just our way of life in general.
And I know another main benefit of wetlands, and that will help with something that's becoming more and more prevalent today, is with flood control.
Exactly, and you know, I think one of the reasons that this property was still intact was because it was swamp, it was hard to farm, it was hard to develop, and so it was left here. So we're lucky for that because it does provide flood control. It is a giant sponge, so when water levels come up, there's a place for that to be drawn into. And if we can increase these wet habitats, you know, again, like you said, the betterment for flood control and people.
All right, Scott, I know you have a pollinator garden on your property. I would really love to see that. Would you mind showing us?
Yeah, let's go do that.
Did you know in parts of southwestern Ontario, over 90% of the area's original wetlands are unfortunately gone? Did you know in parts of southwestern Ontario, over 90% of the area's original wetlands are unfortunately gone? These rates of loss are among the highest recorded anywhere on Earth. Okay, Scott, so this is your garden, obviously. Can you tell us a little bit about it? How big it is, how easy, hard? Any tips or tricks for putting in a pollinator garden?
Yeah, sure. So this front field was historically used for hay production, and we wanted to provide a pollinator garden or pollinator field to allow for not only bees and wasps, but also a lot of our butterflies, moths, and a lot of our grassland birds, snakes, frogs. Everything has been using it, and so we are slowly increasing the amount of native species. Initially, we just allowed the field to go fallow, and that was enough to have a number of wildflowers sprout up, though there were a lot of invasive and non-native species in that mix, and we're slowly taking them out, replacing them with native species. However, right away, we had a large number of pollinators come in, so it's been very exciting to see how this process has started. And in all honesty, it's been relatively hands-off. Nature has kind of taken over, but you do need to maintain and get rid of some of the non-natives that are overtaking the native species. Though there are some non-native flowers that aren't too invasive that are still beneficial to insects, so we're leaving them to the last before replacing them. This front field is approximately 2 acres or so, maybe a bit over 2 acres, providing us a pretty good opportunity to create a big habitat.
Also in your front property here, you have another pond. Is this one you built as well, or is this a natural one? Or
the previous owner did put this one in. I think they needed some of the substrate from that to do some of the other work that needed to be done on the property, and that inevitably ended up being a nice small pond in the front, and it is heavily used by amphibians, which is great. There are some fish in there, and a lot of shorebirds use it. Herons quite often can be found looking for frogs in the pond. But there are some problems associated with this pond, unfortunately. And one of the biggest is the non-native European reed, or Phragmites australis. And it is one of the most invasive plants in southern Ontario right now, which will completely destroy littoral zones or shallow wetland areas. And you'll see it in ditches, you'll see it in swamps, you'll see it in marshes and in ponds as well. And it will overtake native species to such an extent that not only do native plant species not grow, but even animals such as turtles cannot get through the thick bamboo-like structures of this reed.
So you have a very small amount of Phragmites here on your property. What did you do to try and eradicate it from your property?
Initially, we had to spray it, and I'm not a massive fan of spraying anything with chemicals, but we realized pretty quickly if this plant is cut or if you try to pull it out and a root breaks, more of the plant will grow up. And by cutting it, you allow sunlight into the area and it will come back even thicker. So we did use a minimal amount of herbicide, and we put it directly on the plant itself so it didn't impact anything around it. And then after about 3 weeks, we cut. So this patch was actually quite a bit larger than what you'll see today. And we still have to cut down the area right along the edge of the wetland. So this is going to be a work in progress. Any sprouts that do come up in the future, we will treat, but we will use basically a cotton glove so that herbicide does not drip anywhere else, and we cannot do it over water, so we'll have to find a new strategy in areas where the water and the plant are in the same spot. So for now, we are controlling it, and it's the best way to get rid of it that we know until maybe some sort of biocontrol can be figured out, which they are working on, which might be an insect that will kill the plant from Europe. But as soon as you start introducing species from other places to take care of species from other places, there could be problems, but we'll see what happens in the future. For now, we've had some success.
So just before we wrap up, Scott, I do have a question. Since this is your personal land, is there any tips you can share with people about how to do this, maybe in a financially feasible way, or what's the easiest thing for a landowner who has maybe a spare acre or two to put towards habitat rehabilitation?
You know, when we started doing this, we didn't have a lot of money left over after buying the property, so it was allowing maybe a field to go fallow initially and to see what pops up from the start. You can look at finding other people that have an interest, such as yourself, to do a cleanup on your property, whether it's a naturalist group or a similar type of group. And you can also look at opportunities through your local conservation authority for a cost-sharing program for trees and or for funding for wetland creation.
You told us all about species at risk last time, and now you really filled us in on habitat restoration, on a personal landowner perspective, and this has just been amazing, and I want to thank you for letting us know what you have done to your property and possible ideas for other people to implement on their properties.
Yeah, great, happy to be a part of it, and thanks for having me on.
All right everyone, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in nature.